Thank you and welcome to Flexible Standardized Testing Policies in U.S. Admissions. This will focus on the admissions process in American education. My name is Jim McLaughlin, Associate Director for Freshman Admissions at Drexel University. We're really happy to have you here. I think we're up against the Trump effect here. Yeah. So I saw that and I was like, so we are really happy to have you here. But a very important topic that I think is one that's truly growing. And this session grew out of some experiences that I had over the last couple of years. Drexel University adopted a flexible standardized testing policy for admission 2 years back. So this is our second batch of students coming in who have had the option to choose some various testing options that go outside of SAT and ACT. But what I was noticing was that there was a good deal of confusion about what those policies were. How can students take advantage of them? And I saw that confusion not only among the students, but among our counseling colleagues as well. And to be honest, there was some confusion on the admissions side. So, we have become very adept in this, but have we as admissions folks been communicating to each other about best practices, what's working, what's not working, and I think we could be doing more. So that's really why I put forward this session, and I'm really very happy to have an amazing panel with us this afternoon. And as I said, I'll reintroduce myself, Jim McLaughlin, Associate Director for Freshman Admissions at Drexel University, and I will turn it over to Priya.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Priya Gupta, the Senior College and Higher Education Counselor from the International School, Bangalore. I have got experience with working with IBDP and ISC children both in my previous school for 9 years. Just shifted to the new school where it's a complete IB school and it's a boarding residential come day scholar school.
Hi, my name is Amber Langton. I am an international admissions counselor at Michigan State University. It's a large public research institution in, you guessed it, Michigan. It's pretty obvious. This is actually my first year test flexible. I come from universities in the past that required test scores, so I think it's been a very valuable experience for me.
Good afternoon. I'm Saumitra. I'm coming from Bangalore and I work with Greenwood High International School. So it's been 1 year with Greenwood High. I used to work as overseas education counselor with Chopra's for US as a destination. So now with IB curriculum and ISC both in Greenwood High International, Bangalore.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay Skeens. I'm an Assistant Director of Admission at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. We are a completely test-optional institution, and we started that policy for the 2015 academic admissions cycle. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means for our school in particular here in a little while.
So thanks to our panelists, and it's been a lot of fun going back and forth about this topic over the last couple of months as well. Definitely a learning experience for all of us. So here is what we're going to cover today. We're going to give you a little bit of background and scope of the topic today, just to sort of set the table, to give you a sense of how widely this topic is being discussed. We will also frame this in the context of holistic admission review. And some of you who were in the previous session as well, we talked a lot about that. But we know we have a pretty wide range of experience levels at this conference. So we do want to start building some foundation there as well. All of the university representatives on the panel will explain in as much detail as is needed what the actual testing policy is for admission at their institution. We'll talk a little bit about why are institutions adopting flexible testing policies. And then over to the school side, very important to understand what are the perceptions of testing flexible and testing optional policies at universities among those in the school community, the students, the parents, and also the counselors. So we have some great information to present there. And then, of course, we will talk about some examples, brief case studies, and hopefully have some discussion with you as we go. In conclusion, the universities will share some information about student success. How are those students who have opted for a testing flexible policy, how are they doing at our universities? Has there been any difference in terms of admissions outcomes? So we will share some of the information that we've collected in that regard. Now, the panelists that agree with me here that we would be happy to have some discussion throughout. So we would be happy to pause if there's something that really strikes a chord as we discuss. Please feel free to just raise your hand and interject. I think the discussion we would be best served if it's based on relevant issues for you. Okay, so what do we hope to accomplish during this session? First of all, we do want there to be an understanding of what, first of all, from a very, very basic level, what's the difference between test optional and test flexible? In addition, we do want everyone to leave here with a fuller understanding of what does it mean to be a truly holistic admissions office, and what does that mean in the admission process. And then thirdly, I think most importantly, it's for our admission professionals and those on the school side to be confident in advising students, or at least gain additional confidence in this area as we sort of go through this, to really best guide your students to the best fit universities, and also so that the admission process, which we know can cause a lot of stress and anxiety, that it can be a little bit more enjoyable for our students as well, because it's a really exciting time for them. So background. If you read a little bit about the description of the session, according to fairtest.org, there are now more than 1,000 institutions, accredited institutions in the United States that have adopted some form of a flexible standardized testing policy. That could include test optional, that could include test flexible, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But that's a pretty big deal. That's about a quarter of American institutions. And what we've seen is this number has actually grown over the last few years. So in the news recently, been keeping an eye on some of these topics, and as I get my news feeds daily, a couple of notable ones. In June 2017, the University of Chicago has done away with the SAT-ACT requirement. Now, if you read their website and read a little bit more about that, they will still tell you that they'll encourage their students to take it and submit it. And most of their applicants are still choosing to do that. But it's very significant that a student can apply to the University of Chicago, number 3rd ranking, tied in U.S. News and World Report, that they've made such a big switch in their admission policy and moving potentially more to an even more holistic review. Not directly related to the core SAT, but Princeton and Stanford have dropped the writing test requirement, leaving, I think, only 23 universities in the states that actually require that as part of the admission process. So although that's not directly germane to the specific topic that we have, it's still notable that universities are taking further action and really evaluating whether or not their policies are the best approach to take. So what is the difference between test flexible and test optional? So test optional admission offices truly do not require it. A student can get an admission decision without submitting an SAT or ACT score. That's what we mean by test optional. Now, whether they require something in its place, like a graded written work, depends on the institution. Whether they are then requiring a portfolio, again, that's going to vary from institution to institution. But what we mean by test optional is that a student will have an admission decision rendered without submitting SAT and ACT scores. That assumes, of course, that they meet the other requirements, academic transcripts and application essays, and whatever it is that institution would require. Test flexible typically means that a standardized examination is required, but the options that students, from which students can choose, goes beyond only SAT and ACT. So again, test flexible means that a university is still requiring a standardized test result of some kind. And we'll get into that a little bit more as we highlight our own policies, but not truly test optional, right? So in other words, if a student does not submit what is specified by the university as meeting the requirements for standardized test, then they would not have a decision rendered. The application would essentially be incomplete. And why does this matter? And of course, I think we've seen it with our counseling colleagues. Maybe they're having more questions from their students. Perhaps you're getting more questions from your students. We need to be better equipped to advise them. So that's really the significance of this whole thing. So understanding holistic review, I'm just going to start here and then I'm going to kick it over to our panelists. Holistic review, and I know many of you are familiar with this concept already, but for those who are perhaps new counselors or you're coming into advising students coming to the U.S. At a very early stage here, it's important to understand the philosophical difference between how Indian universities evaluate, maybe even somehow British universities evaluate, versus what we mean by holistic admissions, which is very common in the United States. In essence, we're looking at the full profile of the candidate. We're looking at not just a CGPA, not just a test score. We're looking at the context of that curriculum. How rigorous is the curriculum? What are the grade trends in the student performance? Do they have the proper prerequisites for the program? Yes, the test scores may be a factor, but we're also looking at qualitative information like the student's personal statement or essay. We're looking at things like teacher recommendations. What does that tell us about the student's work ethic? Are they a good fit for our universities? Supplemental materials like a portfolio or interviews, right? So we're taking all of that into consideration, typically for both admission and scholarship. Now, there is some difference there between institution, and we'll highlight some of that. But let me turn it over to Lindsay first. Can you just elaborate a little bit more from your perspective about what holistic review is?
Absolutely. So when we are doing a holistic review process, we are looking at the student as a whole and not just as a set of numbers, because ultimately we see our student body and our university as a community, and we want to be admitting a student who is going to be a fit for our community. And a number in a GPA or a number in a test score is not necessarily going to give us that information. Their essay or their personal statement is going to give us a better idea of that. Their extracurricular activities is going to give us a better idea of that. So for us, we're really looking at the whole person and as the student as a person, and not just as a student who's going to come and sit in our classroom, but as somebody who is going to be living in our residence halls, somebody who's getting involved in our campus activities, somebody who's going to be living amongst our current students, and engaging with our faculty members and our students, and the faculty and the staff who already work there.
And kind of to even build on that, a benefit to being a holistic school and reviewing holistically is that it really gives us the opportunity to do a few things, but I think the most important is to make sure that that student is the best fit for our campus, even if there's one piece of the puzzle that might not seem perfect. So that's kind of why that puzzle is up there. Students are not just one piece, right? They're never just their grades or just their test scores like we're talking about today. There are a lot of different pieces that make up the whole picture of that student. And being able to look at all those pieces can help us make sure they're going to fit into our university in the best possible way. But that also means that holistic review and admissions can look a little bit different at each school. Because what's most important for me when I'm looking at students to come into my university is going to be a little bit different than what's most important to Jim when he's looking at students to come into his university. So it really does help, especially on the student and counselor parent side, is when you have questions to talk to the university themselves, because all of our answers might be slightly different. So for me, the most important part of the application is the academics, no doubt, hands down. I really want to see those. But another school might be able to take a lot more weight and put that on the students' experiences because it fits into their campus community in a different way. So as much as we'll talk about this very generally, like how holistic admissions works, there's also a lot of nuances to it. And I think an admissions counselor's favorite thing to say is, it depends. And unfortunately, it's also very true and reflective of all the universities in the United States. It really does depend on which university you're looking at, what they're looking for when they're looking at those students to fit into their community, because it is all about that fit in the end and where the student's going to be most successful and most happy. And that's not going to all depend on one piece of that student.
And I think also to add, it is in the benefit of the student, because if we were only looking at numbers, say something happened to a student during their sophomore or junior year. I know we read a lot of applications where a family member got sick and they had to take care of them, or it really impacted them emotionally and their grades suffered one year. A holistic admissions process can let us take that into consideration as opposed to just seeing a GPA that dipped. So we really are trying to take the student's best interest in consideration, and really see that whole person in any situation that may have come up and not penalize the student for things that were out of their control.
One practical sort of anecdote that I'd like to share, and I'm sure Amber and Lindsay can would echo this as well, is that it's helping our students, especially those coming from India, shift the mentality a little bit about how they're interacting with American university admission professionals and what kinds of questions they're asking. If I had $1 for every time I was asked, what is the minimum to be admitted, I'd probably be very rich. So I think that beginning at that point just shows a philosophical difference. There's there's no fault in the student there. It's the frame of understanding that they're bringing. But really what that then also means is that we typically start with a philosophical discussion with a student in admissions advising. So if they're coming and asking university professionals, what are you looking for? What makes a best fit student for your university? That's a really good question to start with. I would love to get that question. It's very rare. And we understand why that is, right? Because it's an extremely competitive system here in India. The IITs and such are very, very rigid in terms of their academic evaluations. So understanding this holistic review, we need your help in helping the students better understand how to find the universities that are right for them. So moving on, we want to start, we want to continue here with a little bit more of an in-depth explanation of what the university's policies are. And I think among the panelists here, we have probably the most complex one. And Drexel University, a little bit of background, we did adopt a testing flexible policy 2 years back. We welcomed a couple of senior leaders from New York University a few years back who have really kind of migrated a similar policy to Drexel. And really what it means for us is that test scores are required, but students can choose from a wider range of options, which gives them a lot more flexibility in terms of what they feel best represents them as an individual, not just a test taker. So to give you some examples of what alternatives might be, instead of taking an SAT or an ACT, students applying to Drexel could submit 2 SAT subject tests. They could submit 2 AP exam results. They could submit 2 IB higher level examination results or the actual IB diploma itself. Now, what I will say, the caveat here, and there are some caveats that go a little bit more into that, but if they are opting for that, we would ask that one of those examinations be on the quantitative side, and one of those examinations is more on the verbal and writing, so that we have a little bit more of a viewpoint. Yes?
Just, so you are talking about or, not all of them, right? What, either 2 SAT
Or
2 IBH.
That's correct. Yeah, they would choose from one of these options. For a student taking a gap year, for example, and they've completed the IB DP, they can submit their IB diploma results, and we would accept that in lieu of the SAT or ACT. Now, some of them may still submit the SAT and ACT, and we would consider that, but that's an option. We've all...
When you write 2 IBHs, 1 quantitative reasoning and 1 verbal or writing. So suppose a child who does not, whose all 3 subjects are of reasoning, the HL subjects.
They would not be able to choose that option in that case. Yeah, so then they would likely have to choose one of the other ones. Or, and again, most of our students are still choosing to take the SAT or ACT. We'll give some numbers about that later on, but they have the option, right? And I think as students and counselors become more adept at advising students, they might take advantage of these things a little bit more. What we would also say is that if a student is taking a gap year and they've done national boards here in India, they could use those results in lieu of the SAT, in fact. So that's Drexel's policy. And I'm going to move on to Michigan State.
So Michigan State's policy is a little bit less detailed than Drexel's, I guess you could say. It's been longstanding, so I tried to figure out exactly when we implemented this when I was put on this panel. We don't know. It was in place when my boss started 10 plus years ago. So it's been Michigan State's way of doing things for some time. Basically, in order to review a student as complete and for admission, I only need one of 4 test scores: ACT, SAT, TOEFL, or IELTS. I don't need any subject tests. It doesn't have to be a combination of the two. As long as I have one of them, I can consider the student. Now, with that, I can consider them for some scholarships, no matter what. However, some of our larger merit-based scholarships require the SAT. So for those students that really want larger scholarships, which, to be honest, is a lot of them, I do recommend going ahead with that ACT or SAT. A lot of the reason for that is benchmarking, because it's a new scholarship and we want to see how it goes long-term. So that gives a little context for that. A big benefit to doing it this way is that I have a little more flexibility to look at what's important for a specific student and look at the gaps in their performance. So perhaps there's a student who's doing SL math, but they've got really high math section on their ACT or SAT. I can kind of use that to show myself in review. Well, maybe it's a certain area that they're studying in. Maybe they're going to do better on the exam, things along those lines, which has been very helpful. And I'll talk a little bit more about the context for why we're test flexible in a little bit.
I think our program for test optional is the easiest. It's completely test optional. Students are not required under any circumstances to submit SATs or ACT scores to us. The only 2 exceptions to that are if they are student athletes, recruited student athletes. The NCAA does require that they have SATs or ACT scores. And then we have a medical program for U.S. and Canadian citizens that requires the SAT or the ACT score. Other than that, students are not required to submit SAT or ACT scores, and students who do submit test optional are still considered for all of our merit-based scholarships. So there is no implications against them for not submitting test scores to us. Our middle 50% of our SAT is between a 1310 and 1460. Middle 50% of the ACT is between a 30 and a 33. And in our counseling of students, we are very transparent with those numbers. And our counselors are also very transparent in when we're telling students, you really should consider being a test optional student because this is what we're looking for, and these scores could hurt your chances. Yes.
So there's a confusion which is always there here. So when you say U.S. citizen, students who are here and are U.S. citizens, will they be considered for this, or there need to be a tax, something related to?
No, if they're U.S. citizens, they could apply for that program. They don't need to be.
They are living here.
Yes, if they are U.S. citizens, they have a U.S. passport, they would be eligible for that specific program. Yeah.
And I think, yes, go.
Domestic students for the admission process, or would you consider them as international students for the admission? And secondly, would you consider them for in-state tuition or out-of-state or international rates?
Lindsay, can you begin, and then we'll let
Yes.
we'll let Amber answer as well.
Yes, so we are a private institution, so tuition is going to be the same for all students. And then for, if they have a U.S. passport, they are going to be considered domestic students. They will just be considered living abroad.
The same actually applies for Drexel on both counts.
So Michigan State is a little different, and I probably should have added earlier on, we're test flexible only for international applicants. So if you have any students who are U.S. citizens, we need ACT or SAT for those students specifically. So that does change things a little bit because I know most of you guys have a mix. That's generally the case in India. So for tuition purposes, US citizens living abroad are billed as non-resident US citizens. International students have a slightly higher tuition range, to be completely honest. In order to get in-state status for students, they would either have to have their entire family relocate to the state of Michigan, not likely, or they would have to live and work in the state of Michigan for 1 full year without studying, even less likely. So it's fairly difficult to get that in-state tuition status for us as a state school.
And we'll take one more question here because we do have a good deal of other content. Did you have another question?
Has any student ever been refused visa because they haven't taken the standardized tests? Have you ever had that?
It's an interesting question. We have not seen that. We had some discussions earlier this week, just in.
I'm asking on an education USA advice. We have students coming to us saying, the officer said, did you take the GRE or the SAT? And they said we didn't have to take it. They could have a letter from the school saying that it wasn't required. And we have seen 1 or 2 instances of refusal, so that's why I'm concerned.
It's a very interesting discussion, and I would like to. Just by a show of hands, has any other counselor experienced something like that?
So I could answer.
Okay. So let's hold that thought. It's a very valid point, and I think.
You want me to answer that, Jim?
Oh yeah, please go right ahead.
So for undergrad students, as long as you get your I-20 form, it says that you are eligible to land at the university. So they will never have any issues for undergrad students. So
Yeah,
if you're issued a I-20, then the visa officer would not be asking a question.
The I-20 is not a guarantee that you will get the visa.
No. What I meant is that university has done full homework on the English proficiency and the other things, so they will not be denied visa for that purpose. It could be other reasons, but not that.
So I think what I'm hearing, and I have heard of instances where, ultimately, if a visa is denied, it's as you probably have seen, it's unlikely that the student gets a full explanation, although they can infer. They can make inferences. So this is something for, I think, universities and Education USA to communicate on. But let's just table that for a moment. And thank you for bringing that up. So why are more universities, as we said at the beginning, 1,000 plus accredited U.S. institutions now have adopted these kinds of policies? Why? First of all, before I throw it back to the university panelists, I think there have been questions for a long time about how predictive these traditional standardized tests truly are. It really starts with that philosophy. And I'll turn it over to Amber first to speak a little bit to her experience there.
So I think that the point I'm going to hit on is the main reason that Michigan State has been test flexible for so long. ACT and SAT were derived mostly for U.S. students, and then it was exported internationally as students became more and more interested in U.S. schools. And so U.S. schools would require, in some cases, not in all, to have that, to consider students and compare them to their other applicants, right? But a real important thing, especially in the credential analysis community, is that students should be considered in the context of their own culture. And at the time when we adapted this policy, and I think that my colleagues up here would probably agree, we were doing so with the understanding that the ACT or SAT might not be the best reflection of that. And I think in the recent years, they've tried to address that a little bit and making it a little bit more comfortable for other cultures and questions that might be a little bit more relevant and not rely as much on that U.S. context. But it still does stand that this is something that's a very U.S.-centric thing that we're asking students around the world to do. Additionally, it's not always easy to get to. And up until recently, it wasn't easy to find a testing center at all for some students. And in fact, if you're in China, you still can't take the ACT or SAT unless you take part in certain programs. And that was also a really big concern for us, making sure that students can actually physically get a test to apply to our institutions. We don't want that to be a barrier for a student who can't really control that. So that's why we focus our review on those academics and not even necessarily converting those academics to a U.S. scale, but the academics in their whole sense in the system that they belong in. And all of us have people trained in the different educational systems so that we can really do that for a student and give them their best chance when we're reviewing them for our schools. I think
So we're test optional for both domestic and international students, and we did that for several reasons. The first is that there are tons of bright students who just don't test well, and we don't think one Saturday morning should dictate where a student spends the next 4 years of their academic life. We also see a lot of inequity and inequality in the way the tests are designed. There's some students who have access to take the test several times. There are students who have access to test prep at their high schools because they go to well-resourced high schools. There are some students who don't have access to any test prep at all because they don't go to well-resourced high schools. So the inequality and the inequity that is just based within the nature of the test itself is one of the reasons that we chose to go test optional, so that we could eliminate that inequality and that inequity within the test itself. So several reasons for that, but inequality and equity was one of the big reasons for us.
So thank you for that. In the next phase of our discussion, we're going to look at this impact and feedback from the school side. So in this next phase, what I asked Priya and Sumitra really to give us feedback on was what are the perceptions? How well or not well are flexible testing policies understood by those in your community? So we're going to look at these three groups as well in terms of how well it's understood and then also perception. So I'm going to turn it over to Priya. Just hold that thought for, and I want to give a chance to our counseling colleagues to speak here as well. So from the student side, how well are they understanding this?
So usually you also would have faced, Miss, now when the shortlisting starts or something, they start thinking about a program. Miss, I want to pursue this, yet, my test scores are not good. Should I be really applying? Should I be really? So do you have the resources as counselors to guide them as to which are the colleges that they can still apply to? So that's one great resource, which is fairtest.org is one great resource. But if you see 1,000 plus universities are there, that's again, you as a counselor should be, in tune as to what are those colleges and where will they fit in, because there are a number of different kinds of colleges. They could be art and design, they could be state universities. So basically understanding what kind of colleges are offering, and then you guide them accordingly. Sometimes when they don't see, and I'm just sharing our personal example to you, is that there are universities like, for example, Miss, I still want to apply to University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and my score is just 32. And there was another girl who had a 32 score, but was at a 40 IB. I'm talking from the IB perspective. And she thought of applying to Johns Hopkins. She said, no, Miss, I still want to apply. What I want to tell you is that talking of test flexible and test optional policies, yet sometimes don't stop your children from applying to those colleges. Because both the girls, one is at U Michigan and one is at Johns Hopkins. So yes, what we are seeing, the universities are also, they may be having those policies behind them as a rule. Okay, fine, they need the test, but they are also understanding this holistic process, and they may still be accepting your children. But yet there is a confusion which you as a counselor also need to understand, and like how they made you understand. And sometimes we reach out to the universities ourselves and ask them clearly, like I may reach out to Amber, or I may reach out to Lindsay or any other, as to could you explain to us further more as to what it means for you as test flexible or test optional? And they are very helpful to us.
So, regarding the perception of the students, I would really highlight that most of the students are not aware of test optional or test flexibility as a policy. The main reason, yes, as counselors also, due to several reasons, we don't counsel them for a test optional or test flexible policy with the whole students. We will just speak to the individual ones who are really in need of that. Because of that, because of the exposure, for example, I can speak about ACT or SAT. It took lots of years for ACT to get established here in India. Even now, when the parents come and the students, they always have that in mind. They have to take SAT, ACT both. Not all of them. There is a difference in the opinion, but some of them, they are not aware. The same way, from the student's point of view, if you see about test optional or test flexible policy, most of them are not aware. And they have a hesitation in mind. If I opt for a university, which I can apply without sending SAT scores, if I opt for it, will I be led at the back will the other student who is reporting SAT will have an edge over me? So that's another perception of the student. So that hesitation is always there. So the awareness and the hesitation, and these are the basic reasons I don't think students in India have started. There are students who have started to apply, but majority of them have not started considering them. So that's a major perception, I would say. And some students, I'm sure most of the counselors would agree, they feel on the other hand that SAT or ACT can be a replacement for the academic scores. So if they don't do well in the academics, they feel that if they get really good ACT or SAT scores, that will be a replacement. So it's a mixture of perception and lack of awareness, I would say.
On that point,
Yes.
to Amber and Lindsay, what do you, how do Michigan State and George Washington handle sort of that perception, a student who thinks that a really strong SAT score is going to outweigh or maybe cover up an academic performance that was not so strong?
So with the holistic review, we are looking at all of the pieces. So even though a test score may be strong, we are still looking at the academics. And even though the academics may be strong, if they are submitting test scores, we are still looking at those. So all of those pieces do still matter. Academics are still very important to us. Amber said that earlier. Academics are still very, very important to us as they indicate likely success at our institution. So I think it's more of a myth that test scores could kind of make us blind to academics. Academics, I think, are still very, very important.
So I'm going to turn it back to Sumitra here, and can you give a little bit of background about the survey that you conducted, how many students were involved, and then what we'll do is just go through some of the results.
Right. So
I believe all of the PPTs will be available. Their IC3 does have a totally accessible platform, so afterwards all of the sessions will be available. Yeah.
So once me and Priya collected our inputs about what is the student's perception, we felt that it would be fair enough to share it with the students, a questionnaire, and see what do they feel really. Or is it just this is in our mind as counselors that they are not aware. So I shared a list of 10 questions in SurveyMonkey with my IB students, and around 30 of them responded to that. So these are the questions. So the first question was, are you aware, all the questions are not listed, the most important results are listed here. Are you aware if test optional and test flexibility exists, and what are those policies? So if you can see, 53% of them have responded that it's no, and remaining has responded it's yes. So it's a mixture. You can say they are aware, some of them are aware, but some of them are not aware. It's not that popular, it has not gained that popularity in India, I feel.
And I would venture a guess, this is a bit of an assumption on my part, that this was your IB students. So if you're working with your state board or national board students, that the no category is probably going to be higher. Is that a safe assumption?
You could say.
When during the orientation itself, when the students are getting into grade 11, the counselors, if they could inform about this to the students.
So perhaps
The optional and the flexibility, because otherwise people will not be aware of it. I'm sure about that.
that's a good idea. So perhaps working in at least some terminology in terms of those various
I would like
options.
to interfere here.
Go
Jim,
right ahead.
there's a reason why we don't share it with the whole students, because majority of the students apply to a mixture of US universities. I understand that around 800 to 1,000 plus universities are test optional or test flexible. Still, there are universities, lots of universities who need SAT or ACT score. So we tell the students to take it for once. And then we see the scores. And based on each student's profile, as counselors, we recommend. So I don't know if I am hesitant, because when I tell everyone that there is test flexibility or test optional policy, will they be not taking it? I'm not sure. I would like to hear Priya.
Okay, so we are a little different here when we are counseling children in grade 11. That's a time sometimes parents come to us and they are like, when we are discussing as to what they have in their minds about the future. Because the first question, what is in your mind for your child? We do not ask which career, which program, nothing. We just say what is in your mind. Say, for example, a parent may say, or a child may say, okay, fine, we are looking at depending as India as an option, and we may look at US and the other countries. So depending on what their interests are, like how Samitra is saying, in case if they're saying definitely US, then we do tell them, yes, a test optional is an option, but do keep SAT, ACTs in your hand, because at one point of time next year, if you say, Miss, although I was thinking of being test optional and I was thinking of applying only to test optional and text flexible universities, but now I want to apply to a university which needs, then it becomes an issue, because that's the time they cannot work on their SAT, ACTs. So it's our responsibility as counselors to keep them informed, then let them take a decision by themselves.
Can I, before I take any questions here, can I just take by a show of hands, how many counselors in the room include some level of intentional discussion about test optional or flexible in their advising? Okay, so maybe that's about half. Maybe that's about half.
You should do it. It's really important.
Yeah, so I'm going to continue because we want to share some more data here and leave some time for questions. So this here, and we're just going to sort of breeze through some of these. So this question went a little bit further and really was asking students, do you know which universities, right? So some students, about half, were aware that the policies existed, but more than 80% didn't know which universities were there. Sumitra, any comments on this particular piece?
Okay, so the reason I included this question was I wanted to understand which one they prefer, a test flexible option or test to be test optional. So that's the reason I had included. Do you think giving you an option of reporting flexible tests is useful? That is ACT without writing. Current grade 12 students. So in this, majority of them have replied that they have not decided, because most of them are in the mode of applications now. And some of them, 28.57% have replied that they never knew about it, so they would like to consider. Yes, they are thinking of one or two universities and they would like to consider it as an option. Very few have replied that they will not consider it at all. 19.05%, that's it. Okay, so SAT or ACT, from the student's point of view, I wanted to check whether they feel it reflects their ability completely. So 80.95% have responded that no, and 19.05% has responded it as yes. I would like to come back to Lindsay's point that you explained that SAT or ACT, it depends on, it again, it's a test which can be improved. So there was a comment of a student which I would like to add.
Please.
Yes, so the student has commented, it was a really long comment, that's the reason we couldn't add it here. SAT is an attempt to create a standardized exam that works for every syllabus and every program, with an aim to measure intellectual capability rather than intelligence. As such, if SAT wants to measure capability of a student, the student's SAT score should be nearly the exact same every time he or she gives it, because the student's capability should not change drastically between the different attempts. So that was it goes long. So that was the comment from the student when I asked about this. So I think it relates to Lindsay's comment as well.
And Sumitra, would you be willing to share all of the survey results with the audience members who want?
I
Okay, so
can,
please be
definitely
sure
I
that
can.
you do connect if you want to have all of these. We're just presenting some of this here. Okay, so let's continue on because we want to move to some of the other constituent groups. So Priya, what are parents' levels of understanding and or misunderstanding about the policies?
So a parent would definitely think, Miss, you're suggesting this university because they do not take the tests. Are they really good or not? That's one question that you'll always face. So, if it
Is the
yes.
university good?
Is the university good?
Is that the
Is
to
the
clarify?
college
Okay.
good? Have they really done, so because they want admissions, because they want students at their campus, is that the reason that they have gone test optional or text flexible? That is for us now. So what we usually, when we are speaking to children and parents specifically, I always tell them also do the homework and, get to that alumni or the children where they're getting placed after they graduate from the university as to what are they doing, because that's the only way for them to understand as to where those children have gone to, which graduate schools have they gone to, and that will help them understand as to, because like how we have been talking, it's a collaborative effort between the teachers, the students, the counselors, and the parents. So it is important that parents also, when we start meeting them in grade 11 for this, usually we start meeting them in grade 9. But the children who join us in grade 11, we start telling them, start doing this homework and it's a collaborative effort. Start exploring with us. as to what you are thinking about. So they take a university list and they start exploring with us. And one important thing, which is a takeaway for all of you, and I'm sure most of you would be doing that as well, do get to the alumni page, and I'm sure you would also say that, as to where their graduates, undergrads are going forward. That gives a strong indication as to, so it is not that because Michigan State is test flexible, or GWU is test optional, so their children are not doing well in life. So that is not an indication. So that is for us as counselors. You will face this question. You have to kind of do that. And like how I shared this example with you, children who are not doing so well in SAT but are doing well in their studies are still getting to the good universities. So it's SAT. I'm beginning to understand as a counselor is not the only criteria, is one of the requirement. But universities are increasingly going towards, they have been, but they are also showing that. And in fact, just to share that, and just to add one more, Jason Locke from Cornell had done a workshop for us around 3 years back. And he showed as to how a child who had applied from a school in Ahmedabad, and he had just a score of 31 and an IB score of 39, and he had applied for food science, and keeping all the aspects in mind, and yet he was taken for that program because he said 31 was not the deciding factor for Cornell. But no, in general, like in our school, I have seen so many examples that if a child is doing well, that does not become a deterrent, a low ACT score for a child to get into a good. But it's a complete picture.
We're going to talk about successes at the universities at the end. So we're going to kind of swing back to this.
Right. So let me
Talk
move
about it.
on, because we do still have a good deal of content to cover. So if you could just hold that question for just a moment. From the counseling side, and you can see a summary of what our panelists have come up with here, but there was also some survey feedback that you collected here as well, right? Can you share a little bit of background?
Sure. Jim, before that, one more point to add on the previous slide.
Please.
So the parents' conception, there was a question when U Chicago dropped and came up to test optional. There was a feedback from a parent who was very happy and came to the school and said that we are happy that U Chicago has gone test optional. Now the admissions would be really easy. So it doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that. So there are lots of misconceptions of this, and the difference between test optional and test flexibility is not understood by the parents. It's definitely not understood by the parents. It's different. So that awareness has to be created as well. And coming back to your question about the counselor's response. So from my point and Ms. Priya's point, as counselors, we definitely feel and we welcome test optional and test flexibility policies, because we totally believe that cannot evaluate a child's ability, because that's an exam on one day morning and it will not reflect the child's capability. So there are lots of other ways, and the skills and the knowledge what the student learns throughout the high school, throughout their life, which will reflect in their essays, in their academics of 4 years, in the activities which they have done. So test optional as test flexibility is completely accepted with full hands from the side of the counselors. Even if you see, the survey feedback reflects the same. Jim, next slide. So if you see, majority of the people, the counselors are aware of test flexibility and test awareness, unlike the parents or the children. Which one, according to the counselors, they found useful. If you see, they have replied test optional. 75% of them have replied test optional is more useful. It's just the reverse from the child side. Test flexible, 12.50% counselors have replied it's useful. Next slide, Jim. So counselors have asked that whether you have advised any of the students in the past test flexibility or test optional. So yes, there are people who have advised it, but 37.50% have advised. But the other ones, they are still, I think they're coming up, and maybe in future they will be advising more. But as of now, it's 37.50%. A few examples.
So we've had cases, as I just explained to you, and if you see some interdisciplinary courses, or maybe some art and design or music, theater, that's where it's also mentioned on the website. So it's important as US counselors, which I'm sure all of you would be doing, to read about the universities. That's what our work is like doctors. which you would agree. So we keep reading all the time about the university. So I, as a counselor, what I do is, as a practice, I just maybe in a day, I know it is difficult. It's not easy with the work that all of you are doing. Just keep reading about the universities. And another thing which I've started doing is you should join the email, the mailing list. So you keep getting those updates, like U Chicago sent us an update, or any other university. They keep sending us updates as to what is happening, or even if they are not able to visit your university, and just keep reading about those as a page. So there's another example that I'll just share with you, which was little, as we did see some success stories, but I'm just sharing another a little disheartening, was that she was one of our toppers, and she scored a 45 in the IB, and yet she did not go above 28 in her ACT because she just did not want to give. And yet her parents insisted, no, you must apply to all the Ivy Leagues and all that, and they did not allow her to apply to some test optional colleges. And finally, I just said, okay, fine, just let her apply to NYU at least. But it is not that she's going to NYU now. She's very happy with the decision. But sometimes it may work, like how you said that, does it really work? And sometimes it may not work. So it did not work for her, and she was quite sad about it, and she is finally going to NYU. But it's an urge, for the university admission officers, when they're visiting you, you should also express that to them, that it should not be the only criteria. If they are basing that decision, should not be one of those.
So Mitra, what I'm going to do, we don't have time to get into all of these in detail, but if you could perhaps select one
One
of
example,
these
yeah.
to just highlight, maybe elaborate on.
Right. I would like to stress on the last example. So this is the current grade 12 student, Rahul Ravindran. So he is planning to apply for computer engineering or computer science. He is a very bright student to start with, because he has a research paper published, and he has developed lots of games. One of his games is Life Simulator, which has around 1 million downloads. So he's a student like that with a 38 out of 42 IB score. But unfortunately, he's not an exam kind of person. You cannot say exam. He, under time constraint, he cannot perform his best. So in ACT, his score was around 1380. So in this case, for computer science, he has chosen to apply to NYU, because NYU is test optional, because test flexible, because of that. So this is one example which I would like to give. In this case, because NYU is test flexible, it's a very huge thing for him, very good thing for such a bright student. So it's not that he's academically strong, he is bright, he has achieved lots of things. So that's a best example, I would say, the reason why we completely accept and encourage test flexible and test optional policies.
Thank you. And I'm going to turn it to Lindsay. So we're just maybe in the next 1 to 2 minutes, we're going to share some quick feedback about student success, what we've observed actually for students coming to our institutions related to these policies.
Sure. So the 2015-2016 admission cycle was the first year that we implemented test optional. So those students just finished their sophomore year. So we don't have a ton of data on them yet. Well, we don't have any graduation data on them yet. But what we have seen so far is that students who were test optional in their admission process have retained at a higher rate than students who submitted tests to us, which we find interesting. We haven't had a chance to dig into that yet, but those students are retaining at a higher rate. The GPA of our admitted students has also gone up. So if you see on here, in 2013, 14% of our enrolled students had a GPA of 3.9 or higher, and then the class for 2017, 25% of them had a GPA of 3.9 or higher. So we're seeing that test optional is allowing these really high-performing students in academics see GW as an option when they didn't see it before test optional, which I think is really interesting. And then the difference between academic performance once they arrive at GW is negligible at this point. We're not seeing a very big difference between how they're performing in the classroom at this point. So like I said, we don't have a ton of data on them. We don't have more than their freshman and sophomore years, and we're probably still aggregating sophomore year data, but it's negligible. So we're not seeing anything major at this point.
Yeah, I would echo that for Drexel. We do have a fairly small sample size. We just have two cohorts that have come in And it's really only a handful of students at this stage who have matriculated after pursuing this option. But what we've seen is that they're doing well. I mean, their average GPA is almost 3.9, so 3.88 at the end of our spring term. So we were pleased to see that. I mean, there's more that we need to do as time goes on to just ensure that how we're evaluating is actually lining up with student performance. But at the early outset, we haven't seen any disadvantages. We haven't seen any red flags in terms of student performance and student success. So all positive from our side.
And Michigan State's policy is much longer standing, so I don't have any recent comparisons to offer. But we do check up on our students every year. During the summer, that's part of what we're doing with our free time. And we've noticed that, as you would expect as counselors, the students that we admit that have very strong academics in their system, but perhaps a little bit weaker test scores that they may have just sent in, are usually doing really well on campus. The places we see more variation in students is where their academics were maybe a little bit lower, but they had the higher test scores. And we were flexible. And those students, it's just not consistent how they're going to do on campus at all. So I personally have found that fascinating. And it really kind of validates what you as counselors say every day, that the test isn't really reflective of what the students are capable of. And I think that using the test flexible option or the test optional option gives us as counselors in the university side more flexibility to look at what you're already telling us and focus in that area.
So that's it we just have a couple of minutes left. So if we can squeeze in a couple of questions, we'd be pleased. Yes.
I would ask to the panel of counselors. So if we don't take, we do not go by the optional or we do not follow that, I'm opting out of the test. Don't you think so? If we even talk about the holistic part, we are increasing the level of, like, we ask them to write research papers, we ask them to participate in all the activities, we ask them to go about their essays and everything else, which is becoming even more complex. Like, you must be knowing how complex the entire system is already. It's infused with a lot of tests. If we don't allow them to take tests, we start building on the profiles from standard 9. So don't you think so on that part, as counselors, we need to talk, convey this message to the university, so literally work on the mediocres as well, because again the space has been created for the children who are high graders or high scorers. And we are actually working on them. Let's be honest, it's high time that we create some space for the mediocres, because it's not available in India and not available internationally. So I would like to get some points.
Just a small thing, writing research papers and other things, those are not mandatory things and those cannot be mandated as well. Those are the students' interest, which comes with their own interest and capability, I would say. So if someone is really interested in volunteering, let them do. If someone is not interested, we will not ask them to do, and we should not ask them to do. It should be, and in India, I don't know, we have parents who come and talk to us and ask, okay, what should he or she do this summer? Let them decide we can guide them, but what interests them. It can be being part of football team. It can be writing a research, doing a research. It completely depends on the kid. So I think, I totally think that US universities want the same. They don't want us to tell the student to do this, do that. No, I don't think so. So keeping that in part, even the mediocre students, when we say mediocre, academically they may be mediocre. They may be good, or they may be really well in something else. So they can pursue that. So my answer would be something like that. I would like to pass to Priya on that.
Yeah, I would agree with Soumitra. So I'm just sharing 3 examples with you right away. There's one girl who was only at a 32 grade point. Her ACT score did not go beyond 26, and she had done a tour of some liberal arts colleges, and her aim was to get into Franklin and Marshall. Now she is still at Franklin and Marshall, which is one of the top liberal arts colleges in Philadelphia, and because when she got in touch with the admissions officer and the college had come to our school, they said, you just present us a graded paper. So she did not she did not have the inclination or maybe that time, because she was putting so much of effort in her studies to make a work with the research paper because she was doing some other things working with an organization. So she just presented a graded paper, and that is what helped her in getting there.
Okay, so actually, just to be, sorry. Just to be respectful of everyone's time, we have ended. I don't want to be presumptuous, but would you stay around for a few minutes so that we can have some dialogue afterwards? But that will be the official end of the session. Thank you so much. Can I just have a round of applause for our panelists here? And we'd be happy to stay around to answer some individual questions as well. Thank you for a lively session.